Okay, Genesis chapter 45. We are rapidly closing in on the end of the book of Genesis. And while I'm thinking about that, we do have the other shipment of the last shipment of the next study books on the front pew. If you haven't gotten one of those yet, the title of it is You Shall Be My People, and it covers the Exodus even on into when the children of Israel went into Gilgal. So I guess we could say Goshen to Gilgal. As we'll learn today, Israel and his family goes down into that area. And so what we have found thus far is that God has created the world. He's created all things therein. He has created mankind, and it wasn't long after the creation that every thought in man's heart was only evil continually, and God looked upon that and repented that he had, sorrowful that he had created mankind, except for 8 souls. And who were those? Okay, Noah and his family, that's right. And so Noah built an ark, which is basically a big box, but it was a boat that floated. And he put the animals in the ark as per God's instructions, and it began to rain. And it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And Noah and his family were in the ark about 150 days before the earth dried enough for them to go out, and so they came out and brought the animals out. And what was God's charge to Noah and his family as they came out of the ark? Yes, Ken.
Wasn't it sacrifice?
No, not a sacrifice. Bill?
Be fruitful and multiply.
Right. Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Because in the flood, all things died except for what was in the earth and those things that God didn't kill and that could swim. And so that would have included fishes and those types of things. But a little bit later on, mankind decided he was going to huddle together and make a name for himself and build a tower, and that was Tower of what? Babel, okay. And so God confused the language of mankind, and as a result, they what? Scattered, that's right. And so they began to fulfill the will of God even through their disobedience, because God confused their languages and they had to scatter to different portions of the land. And so they continued to do that, and as they scattered, we talked a little bit about that. Different peoples lived in different areas, and how Noah's sons, what were their names?
Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Yes, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and how that the blessing of the father went through Shem, and Ham was the father of Canaan, and Canaan was the father of the Canaanites, right? And Japheth lived over in the east for the most part, over in the Mesopotamian area, and even later on up into what is modern day Turkey now. And so after that, God made promises. There was a man born by the name of Abram, the son of Terah, and Terah took his family up into Haran in northern Syria, and they stayed there for a while, and God said, Abram, I want you to take your family and go down to a land that I will show you. And so he began to make promises. And so in Genesis chapter 12, we find where that God made 3 promises to Abraham. What were those 3 promises, Audrey?
Land, seed, and nation.
Okay, the land, seed, and nation. And the land would have been fulfilled in Canaan. The nation would have been fulfilled in Israel, that's right. We learn about that today. Again, we see the beginning of that fulfillment. And then the seed promise was through Christ. That's right. So that brings us down. I'm skipping a lot of history there, but I don't want to go through all of that. I just want to spend a little bit of time getting us to the nation portion of that promise. And so, as we see in the note, or in the black box, text box in the middle of page 115, the promise repeated here is the nation promise. And that's talking about what we learn about beginning with chapter 46. And so Wednesday night, as I stated at the end of the class, we kind of had a cliffhanger where Joseph's brothers are brought back into Egypt because Joseph's cup is found in Benjamin's sack. Their money is found in their sacks, and they're brought back. Joseph had his steward go out and get them, and they bring them back under the charge of theft. And so the brothers are brought back into Joseph's house, and Joseph meets with them. And at the conclusion of chapter 44, we have mainly in chapter 44, we have mainly Judah's defense of his brother Benjamin. And why is that? Why does Judah feel like he has to defend Benjamin? Bill?
Because of his promise he made to his father.
Okay. All right, so when he talked his father into allowing Benjamin to come back down with him into Egypt, he says, I will be surety for him, or I will take care of him. Anything happens to him, you can put that on me. Interestingly enough, we learned in our study this morning that 2 of Judah's sons had already died in the land of Canaan, and Onan. Don't know anything about that. Moses just tells us that that had occurred. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But you remember how Judah had previously said, or Reuben had previously said, take my 2 sons. And now Judah, rather than saying that because he'd already lost 2 sons, he says, whatever occurs, whatever happens to the boy, put it upon me. And so when Joseph said, I'm going to take the one that is guilty of the theft and let the rest of the brothers go, Judah says, oh, we can't do that. So he begins to talk about that. That's how chapter 44 ends. And so now in Genesis chapter 45, we learn that Joseph reveals himself to his brethren. He could withhold himself no longer. And 45 opens thusly, verse 1. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, have everyone go out from me. So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And so when we first read that passage, we might think, oh, Joseph has gotten mad at Judah because he's trying to resist him. But that wasn't it at all, was it? Joseph was so glad to see his brothers. He was especially glad to see Benjamin. He had already bestowed great gifts upon Benjamin in regard to the feast that they had. He had given him 5 times more food than any of the other brothers, and the other brothers had plenty to eat, no doubt. But here he is especially glad to see them, and he can't hide himself from them any longer. And so he says, everyone get out from here. And the only ones that remained were Joseph and his brothers. So Joseph wept aloud, so much that all his servants and Pharaoh's household heard what was going on. And so you can imagine their confusion after Joseph had sent his steward to get these men and bring them back down. And he had charged Benjamin with theft. He told him he was going to keep Benjamin. And then Judah has his speech here. And then all of a sudden, Joseph breaks down. They had probably never seen that in their leader before. And so he says to his brothers, I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live? His most concerning thought was about his father Jacob. His brethren were all there. All 12 were together for the first time in many, many years. But he wanted to know about his father. He knew his mother, Rachel, had died back before he was sold into slavery in childbirth with Benjamin, and that was a very sad event. But now he wants to make sure that Jacob is okay. Are they actually telling me the truth about what's going on with Jacob? And so his brothers were speechless. They didn't know what to say. Now, let's just backtrack just for a second and think about their experience. The first time they came down to Egypt, and Jacob knew who they were, but they didn't know who he was, what did he accuse them of?
Being spies.
Yeah, you're spies. You come down here to see how defenseless we are during this time of famine. Oh no, we're sons of one man. We're not spies. All right, and then he sends them away with as much grain as they can carry and their money in their sacks. They get to the place of lodging. One of the brothers opens his sack to feed the animals, and there's the money. Oh, we're in trouble now. Yet they go on home to their fathers. And meanwhile, all knowing that if they were to come back, they had to bring who? And moreover, who had been kept in Egypt as prisoner? Simeon. And so now, as far as Jacob is concerned, they're down to 10. Joseph is not, and Simeon is not, and now you want to take my youngest? And so the brethren here, those brothers are really in a tight spot, and so you remember how they all worked that out. And Judah says, I'll be surety for your youngest son, for the boy. And so they go back. They have a feast. The next morning they get up and they take off with their grain. And here comes the steward right after them. And so Benjamin, as a result of having Joseph's cup and his money for the grain, is accused of being a thief. And they're all brought back together, and their emotions are way up here, because they don't know what's going to happen. And then the next thing that happens, Joseph breaks down, sends everybody out of the room, and confesses that he is Joseph. What? And I don't know what's running through their mind if Joseph had already suggested to them, do you not know someone in my position can divine? In other words, do you not know that I know who's got my cup? And I know what you've done and how you've stolen from me. And so what are they thinking? Wow. No wonder they're speechless. All the while thinking, we didn't listen to our brother back there in Dothan. And so now it's coming back on us. They were troubled. They were confused. They were speechless. And Joseph says, come near to me. So they come near, and he says, I am your brother Joseph. At one point during the conversation, he said something about his speech and his mouth. He says, you know, and Benjamin knows, that this is my mouth that's speaking these words. You know this is Joseph's mouth. Up until this point in time, how had they conversed? Through an interpreter, that's right. So, Egyptian, whatever language the Egyptians were speaking, that's what Joseph spoke through this interpreter to his brethren. And they were hearing what he was saying, not understanding, but he was hearing what they were saying, understanding. And he knew what they were saying to themselves and how their attitude was toward him and how their attitude was toward themselves, and that we have really done something wrong here and it's coming back on us. So we don't often talk about that and the situation, the relationship that they had there and the distress that the brothers were under. And I'm not saying that it wasn't due. It was due, no doubt. But at the same time, we can understand how they would react like this. Murphy, you have points you want to make.
This statement about Joseph knowing of his mouth. That's found down in verse 12. I'm reading from King James. And behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin, that it is my mouth that speaketh unto you. Mm-hmm. Verse 12.
Right. All right, Billy?
Unconditional love and forgiveness is probably the best example outside of Jesus in the Bible.
Right.
And it's for after everything on a personal level that was done to him by these people. And then he's still, the old saying, blood's thicker than water. You know, unconditional, no matter what, he still loved them and he still forgave them.
Right. That's right. And when he, and I'll get to you just a second, Ken. When he pulls them closer in, he says, and this is not something that I don't think that he's trying to get back at them out or throw in their face or anything, but he's saying, I'm Joseph. I'm the one you sold to Egypt. I'm that young boy that you knew 20 odd years ago. So he's using that to remind them, to prove to them that he knows who they are, and that in saying that they would realize that he is who he says he is. Ken.
I was just saying, well, part of their reaction had to be, this is the one we sold into slavery, and there's a lot of guilt there. I'm sure they've felt it all this, but now they're faced with the guy.
That's right.
And he's in power.
Yes,
and,
yes.
And for him to say, God sent me before you to preserve you with prosperity in the earth. I mean, he's attributing all this to God, and it's like, well, wait a minute, thank you, but that's not how we feel about it.
Right. And then too, on adding to that, they had seen their father go down these 20 odd years and grieve because of Joseph. And I think we all know, we've been, each of us no doubt, been around death enough to know that if you lose someone very close to you, let's say, for example, I was out, somewhere off on a trip or something, and something happened to me, and I died, and I was gone, and they couldn't find my family or something. They just decided what the state does is generally cremate someone, and they put them on a shelf or put them in a cemetery somewhere, some plot. If my family didn't know where I was or what happened or how I died or anything, there would be a lot of grief there. But then when you have someone who, like my father, I was there when he drew his last breath. I knew what happened. I saw him go. And that helped with my grief because I understood all of that. But Jacob had no idea what happened to Joseph. All he knew is that last time he saw him, he was walking out the door to go see his brethren. And so there's a deep, deep grief there that would have displayed itself all through their lifetime. And that would have really worked on the conscience of these men. And so to find Joseph alive, it's just, amazing too. But let's go on and talk a little bit more about their meeting. Joseph could see their fear. He could see their confusion. He could see how they just didn't understand. And he told them not to be worried, not to be angry with themselves over this, but it was God. It was God that did this. And so another point I want to make, and just so much application that can be found in these stories. But another point I want to make is this. Sometimes things happen to us Think about Joseph as a young 17-year-old being thrown into a pit by his own brothers. You know, I have to admit, I got kicked around a time or two by one of my brothers, and so I thought that was just a terrible thing, you know, but I understood. I was probably in the way most of the time. But to be thrown in a pit and then be sold into slavery, to be put into prison and left there for 2 or 3 years, and then finally brought out. You know, most of us would have probably had a little bit of an axe to grind. But here Joseph sees the good that comes out of it. He sees what God has done. And granted, you know, if we're mistreated, we're not likely to rise to second in command. But this happened by the power of God to preserve his people. Think what would have happened had he not sent Joseph down into Egypt.
There would have not been a remnant.
Right? There would have been a famine, and the famine most likely would have consumed the family, like many others who suffered through that same thing. But God prepared a way. And so Joseph is mindful of that. And his idea is that if God could use me to be good for others, to do good for others, no matter what I have endured, it is worth it. And more so, Joseph's really saying, I have been able to save my family because of blessings God has brought home. And Joseph really didn't know half of it, did he? Because Joseph was there at that point in time to save that family, and not only that family, but the lineage of Christ that would come through that family. And I think that's why it's so interesting that Judah is the spokesman, because that's the lineage through which Christ came. And so he's there bearing the brunt of all the responsibility, and Judah is doing his part in all this as well. Unbeknownst to him, it's kind of like Mordecai said to Esther, who knows that you were not brought to this point in time to save a whole people. And so time and time after again, God has been merciful to us and has taken care of us. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is this. If something bad happens to us, let's try to see through the moment and see, and I know we can't see the end from the beginning as God does, but let's have faith enough to understand that this too shall pass, and in passing, perhaps we can be used as a tool to help someone else get through the same situation, and even beyond that, be a better person, and as we say sometimes, a better version of ourselves than we were before.
Jeremy,
Yes.
that's why James would say, James 1, count it all joy every year.
Right.
Because it will mature you as
Yes.
I come of that.
That's exactly
I
right.
don't think these brothers don't have a whole lot of problems from this point on.
No, I don't think so either. Murphy?
Going back to Joseph and his emotions, page 114, when Judah made this, Brother Walter says, when Judah made this emotional speech, Joseph could restrain himself no longer. He ordered everyone out of the room with his brothers. Brother Walton said, then he gave vent to the pent-up emotions of 22 years and wept aloud, weeping, he wept so loudly, the Egyptians outside the room heard, and the whole house of Pharaoh heard the news quickly. I think I've told you before, Brother Walter, I heard him one time in a sermon in Athens at Jackson Drive talk about some elder who had read this story. And he said, well, Joseph must have been some kind of a wimp crying like that. And then Brother Walton paused and looked at us as only Bob could. And you can probably see him in your mind's eye, I can. And his voice rising with emotion, he said concerning the other, he said, the heart of a man who could make that comment as far as emotion must be, had he boomed the words out, dead as a stone, and then he just paused and let that sink in. I think I may have said amen.
Yeah. So Joseph goes on then to explain that the famine was not yet over. So it's still 5 years of this. He says, you think it's bad now, and y'all are struggling now, there's 5 more years of this. You're not going to be able to withstand it. You're going to have to go back and get my father and bring him here. So we need one another. God has sent me to preserve a remnant in the earth. What an interesting statement to be made. In verse 7 of Genesis 45, he says, and God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his household and ruler over all the land of Egypt. I wonder when it was that Joseph came to that conclusion in his mind. He could see all this as it was laid out. He was a very wise man, no doubt. A wise man, as from his own words to Pharaoh, a wise and discreet man. And he was able to pull all of this together to be able to feed nations. Not just the Egyptians, but nations. So he was able to see how that God had worked through him the ability to preserve this remnant, this family, so that the lineage of Christ could continue. And we look at that and we see that it's such a great and marvelous and spectacular thing, and it is. But just think about it this way. This is just one little step. I say little. This is one little step along the way that God preserves Israel so that Jesus might come through the lineage of Judah. I don't know, and I think we get so narrow sometimes in our thoughts, and I say narrow from the standpoint that we're focusing, and there's nothing wrong with that. We need to focus on what's right in front of us, but let's understand that we put all the pieces together so we can see that thread that runs from creation to Christ and even beyond. This is one little step along that way. But it's such a marvelous and wonderful thing. And for us to be recipients of all of that, I know this is sounding more like a sermon than it is a Bible class, but for us to be recipients of all of that, wow. The blessings the Lord has brought upon us. Okay. So he uses the word remnant here, as I mentioned, and so this word remnant will become very important to Israel's family later on. Long after they all have been dead and buried, God preserves a remnant after that long period of captivity in Assyria and Babylon and brings them through it. Now, that's not to say that many children of Israel did not perish in the captivity in Egypt, in the captivity in Assyria, in the captivity of Babylon, and all of the battles between those periods of time, they did. But faithfulness to God through all of those periods saved those people. God's blood, Jesus' blood, covered their sins, their souls, just as it covers ours today, only it reached back. So they were looking forward, and we look back to the death of Christ. But that word remnant is very important, and I think we see it even today, as it seems to be more and more people in the world that are some type of religious people, use that phrase loosely, seem to be following so many things other than what the Bible contains. God will continue to reserve a remnant to be his people. And so God made, and this is an interesting way of putting things, I think, that Joseph says that God has made me a father to Pharaoh. It's almost like Joseph here is head of the family of Egypt. You know, he's taking care of everybody. He's taking care of Pharaoh. And he really is, isn't he? But through God's blessing, through God's direction, is he taking care of Pharaoh. And so God had made him a father to Pharaoh to rule Egypt. And so then comes the point in time when Joseph tells his brothers to quickly go back to Canaan. This is an urgent matter. Go back to Canaan and get Jacob, because you don't really understand the seriousness of this famine. Joseph could say, you know, I was there when Pharaoh had the dream. I was there when God revealed the dream to me, and I gave that answer to Pharaoh. I know what's coming. This is going to be a famine so bad that everyone around will forget the prosperity we had the previous 7 years. Go back quickly and get my father Jacob and bring him here. Tell our father, so I got a misspelling there. Tell our father that I live and that I rule Egypt. And again, this is not Joseph standing up there saying, I told you guys so when I had those dreams that y'all bowed down to me. That's not him doing that. That's him saying, God has placed me here for a reason. Now go get my father and bring him here, and let's be prosperous together here in the land of Egypt. Bring him here to Goshen so that all may be well and safe. And so let's look back at our text. Verse 9, hurry. This is chapter 45 of Genesis, verse 9. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. And you shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, and your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I will also provide for you, for there is still 5 years of famine to come, lest you and your household and all that you have be impoverished. So go get my father. Bring him here to Goshen. Now this is the first time that we hear about Goshen. Goshen was a very prosperous region of Egypt in the midst of the Nile Delta. And here in just a little bit, if we get that far, I'll have a map that shows Goshen. If you look even at a satellite image today of that area, you see the Nile Valley, and it branches off into those cataracts. That whole area around those cataracts of the Nile is green and lush. Everything beyond that is brown. So Joseph is bringing them to the heart of that Nile Delta where they can live and prosper with their families and their herds. So then again, he emphasizes, you see that it is I that speaks to you. Tell my father of all my glory in Egypt. Joseph embraced Benjamin, and they both wept for joy, and he embraced his other brothers as well, and they talked for a period of time after that. Can you imagine? Here, this man that everyone has to answer to. No one Pharaoh said, no one in the land of Egypt will even so much as lift their foot without your knowledge. And, okay. You will only be second to me on the throne. Here's this little shepherd boy, 17, that told these two dreams to their brothers, and they hated him so badly that they sold him into the hands of the Ishmaelites. And now he is second in command over Egypt. Who can do that but God? Ken?
Two dreams made them hate him, and 2 dreams put him on top.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. And so they had a happy reunion there. And so word comes to Pharaoh that Joseph's brothers were in Egypt. There are two ways this could have gone, right? But Pharaoh is very happy about that. Pharaoh was happy with Joseph, wasn't he? He was happy that Joseph was happy. He wasn't embarrassed that Joseph's brothers were there. He wasn't jealous because Joseph had found family. He was joyful over that. And I can't help but believe that is because Joseph did such a wonderful job with managing this famine and all that had and his house greatly. And so Pharaoh told Joseph to have the brothers lade their beasts with provisions and bring Jacob and their families to Egypt to live off the fat of the land. How about that now?
What fat?
Yeah. What's that?
You just said what fat?
Oh, well, Egypt was prospering during this time. They really were, because they were basically getting the world's goods brought to them to trade for grain. And they still had that prosperous region of the Nile Delta, even though there was not anything that was growing at that particular time. They still had evidently what was needed to shepherd flocks. And so even Pharaoh, and this is a point to remember, even Pharaoh had flocks because Joseph had been over those as well. He was taking care of them. So that's one thing to remember, especially when we come to our next study, the beginning of the book of Exodus.
Jeremy,
Yes.
Pharaoh was also profiting greatly out of this because his own people are suffering and they have to die. And it gets to the point that they have to give themselves and their herds and their crops to Pharaoh.
Right.
So it solidified his position.
It sure did. It sure did, yeah. Lands and just everything. Everything that they had that was merchantable, that they could trade for grain to survive. And that was the case with every nation around. Okay. So next, Pharaoh commands the brothers to take wagons for their families' transport and return them to Egypt. You take these wagons and you go and you bring your wives and your little ones, your father, back down here to Egypt. He said, just leave your household goods behind. You won't need any of that, because we've got more of that than we can stand now. Can you imagine the things that people had brought down to trade for grain that they would have had? Overflowing with those types of things. And they would have lasted and been very good for use in the dry and arid country of Egypt. And so you come down and you enjoy all of these things in Egypt at my expense. So that shows the gratitude that Pharaoh had for Joseph. It's almost like a light bulb goes off in Pharaoh's head and says, now I can finally do something for Joseph. He's done so much for us. And so Joseph gave the brothers wagons for transport and provisions, including new garments. He gave Benjamin 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of garments. He sent 20 donkeys to Jacob, laden 10 with goods of the country and 10 with food. So that was quite a caravan, really, because, you've got 10 men traveling, and then they're really only bringing what they can take back. They're bringing animals to put the grain on and take it back, because Jacob says, go buy us a little food, enough to get by. But they come back with all these wagons and this 20 mule team, 20 donkey team, laden with all these things. And so it was a good thing. blessed thing to see, no doubt, from Jacob's standpoint. And so Joseph sends his brothers on home. He tells them, don't fall out by the way. Don't argue on the way home. Don't be grieved at yourself. Don't think something bad's going to happen because you sent me to Egypt. Just go on. I think Joseph had an idea that Reuben was going to get on Judah about what happened back there 20-something years ago. He said, don't do that. Go home, be happy along the way, get my father and your household and bring them back to us. So they went on their way and they came to Canaan, to Jacob their father, and they told Jacob that Joseph was alive and his heart fainted. Some translations say it stood still. Today we would say it stopped. Not literally, but from the standpoint of this can't be true. Jacob could not believe what they were saying to him. Do what?
He's the governor of all Egypt.
Yeah. You know that guy that said we were spies? You know that guy that kept Simeon in prison? You know that guy that put our money back in our sacks? Let me tell you what else he did. When we got down there, he tried to keep Benjamin. And he put his cup in Benjamin's sack. And his steward brought us back to his house, and we were all dead men. And he said, I am Joseph. What a story. What a story. And then even Jacob still didn't believe until he saw all the wagons. And he said, it is enough. My son Joseph is alive. I will go see him before I die. So what a story, what a story. Wow. Now,
Can you imagine the brothers having to go back up there because they got to tell Dad now that Joseph is alive, and they've also got to explain how he came to be where he is.
right.
That was a real burden on them.
Yes, yes. And that was probably the worst thing of all. And that may have had something to do with the fact that Joseph said, don't argue on the way. You know, don't get tore up about all this. Let's make this a good thing. Get my dad, and you bring him down here. And so I think the statement, it is enough, speaks to that, Al. It is enough. My son Joseph is alive. In other words, that's all that matters. Let me go see him before I die. So Joseph, chapter 46, we'll get into this. We may not get done, but we've got about 10 slides to go through here, but we'll get into it anyway. Jacob goes down to Egypt. And so they leave from Shechem, the Oaks of Mamre, Hebron. So far as we know, they're still there. And they go down to Beersheba. Beersheba is an important portion in the land. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But remember, we previously have talked about this idea of the word beer in front of something else. What does that mean? Well, yes, that's right. Well. And so there's Beer Lahairoi, there's Beersheba, there's all of these other places where they dug wells. And we remember the strife that there was between Abraham's people and Abimelech's people. And then even after that, Isaac and Abimelech and all the situation with the wells there. But this point of Beersheba was the southernmost point in Canaan. Once you left Beersheba, you got over in the wilderness, and you'd have to go through the wilderness in order to get down to Egypt. So there was a natural buffer there between the land of Canaan and Egypt, so to speak. Beersheba was also the place where Abraham dug the well to begin with, had that agreement with Abimelech, and they named it Beersheba because it was the well of the oath. Same place Isaac went to. He found that Abimelech's people had covered the well in, or filled the well in. They did that to kind of protect their border over there in the Philistine region. And Isaac redug the well, you remember, and they came and had an issue with Abimelech's people, and he moved on, he dug another well, and they followed him, had an issue there, and he went on and dug another well. So finally he and Abimelech had another sit down about those things. But after Jacob offered sacrifices to God there, God appeared to him in a vision. And he told Jacob, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. Previous times, his people had been told not to go down to Egypt. Isaac had been told to stay in Gerar, near where Abimelech was. He said, stay here and live in this area. Do not go down to Egypt. And I think there was a reason for that because of who was ruling Egypt at the time. God promised that he would make a great nation of Jacob's family. So this is where we get to the point of page 115 and the dark box there where the promise repeated to Jacob here is about the great nation. And certainly, they're on the very precipice of that occurring. So he promised Jacob that he would go down to Egypt with him. I will go with you, I will be with you. I will take care of you in Egypt. He also promised Jacob that Joseph would be the one to close his eyes in death. You will see your son. You will form that relationship again with him. It will be a caring relationship, and he will be there when you draw your last breath. And so then, that next day, they left Beersheba and went down to Egypt, carried all of his family down there, Jacob, his sons, their wives, their children, along with the livestock, and all their property went down. It seems that Jacob made sure they took everything with them. He really didn't heed Pharaoh's words. He said, we're going to take everything, and I think the idea is that we don't want to be a burden here to this king that is going to take us in and take care of us. All his descendants went with him. And it seems to me that Jacob really doesn't understand the wealth of his son Joseph yet. And really, that has never come up. That doesn't come up in Scripture. That's not an issue. But we do see how that the whole family flourishes because of Joseph and Pharaoh's blessing. So Moses stops here at this point in time in chapter 46, and he gives us an accounting of all of Jacob's descendants. Leah's descendants, 33. We're not going to go through all the names. Zilpah, Leah's handmaid's descendants, 16. Rachel and her descendants, 14. Bilhah, her handmaid's descendants, 7. This gives us a total of 7. Now, in chapter 46 and verse 26, the writer tells us that there were 66 souls there listed. But the difference is that Joseph and Manasseh and Ephraim were already in Egypt. What 26 tells us is the people that left the Oaks of Mamre and went down into Egypt. The previous verses tell us the whole family. And you say, well, that's only 47. But Jacob is subtracted from that because the 46 tells us these are Jacob's descendants. And so would not include him. And so that's the reason 66 is mentioned there. Let me get over to the next slide. Although they died, Judah's sons, and Onan, were counted as part of the 70. As I mentioned, 46 and verse 26 tells us 66 souls. This leaves out Joseph, his 2 sons, and Jacob, because it tells us there that there were the descendants of Jacob does not include him. In Acts chapter 17, Stephen, in his accounting of the history of Israel, brief accounting, he mentions 75 souls that went down into Egypt. This would include the sons of Manasseh and Ephraim, shown over in Numbers 26. And Brother Waldron explains that here by saying that Stephen was most likely referring to the Septuagint, which would have included that accounting in Numbers. So that's when you see those different numbers, 70, 66, 75, that's what they're talking about. Both had sons. Manasseh had 2 sons, Ephraim had 3, and so that accounts for 75 sons. The reason I bring that up is sometimes you'll hear people talk about the perceived inconsistencies in the Scripture in regard to that. Well, there's always an answer, and that's the answer in connection with that. And so here, I know you can't see the map very clearly, but the purple line is actually Jacob and his family coming into the land from Aram. You remember that? He come back into the land. He saw his father Isaac for a period of time before Isaac died. Jacob and Esau buried Isaac there in the cave of Machpelah. They travel on up toward Shechem, and on the way, Rachel dies, and they bury her alongside the trail there, the route that they took. And so Shechem is where they lived for so long. That's where the green line comes into effect. The green line is Joseph's travels at the hands of the Ishmaelites from Dothan down into Egypt. The red line shows their travels from Beersheba down into Egypt. It doesn't account for the fact, you see the distance between Beersheba and Shechem, it doesn't account for the fact that they still live there and they travel down as a family. That's the idea. But you see down here, let's see if I can get the you're not going to be able to see that because it's going to bounce off the screen. But here is the Nile Valley as it comes up out of Africa, and the cataracts of the Nile and the Nile Delta. Goshen would have been over in this area somewhere. So the southeastern region of the Nile Delta was where they would have lived. So Jacob sent Judah ahead to Joseph so that he could get directions over to Goshen. Where is it that you want us to go? Where should we live? Joseph obviously told the brothers of Goshen. You remember that from chapter 45 that we read a moment ago. He did so, and all of the family made their way to Goshen. Joseph prepared his chariot to meet them there and did so. And so Joseph finally gets to see his father Jacob, his father Israel. And he fell on his neck, and they wept for a long time. And Israel said, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face, and that you are still alive." I tried to go back. I thought it was interesting that the scripture here used Jacob and Israel interchangeably. And I tried to go back and see if there was a time when that stopped. But Jacob is continued to be identified as their father throughout the end of the book of Genesis, and even in other passages in the Old and New Testament. And Israel is also used that way. But in this particular chapter, it seems like when they leave Beersheba and they get over into Egypt, Moses is specific about using the word Israel to describe this man's name, uses this man's name throughout this chapter to show us something. And I think he's showing us that this is the seat of where the great nation began, the nation of Israel. That's just my idea about that. That may not be accurate at all, but I thought it very interesting that when they left Beersheba, Moses uses the word Israel to identify this man who would have this great nation. Okay, one more slide. We'll be through. Joseph told his brothers that he would go up and tell Pharaoh that they had arrived, and he explained to them, now when Pharaoh comes down and he talks to you and he asks you what your occupation is, tell him that you're shepherds, which was obviously true. Tell him that you're shepherds so that he'll allow you to remain here in Goshen. He'll prepare this area for you because all of the Egyptians hate shepherds. Pharaoh had flocks and herds. Joseph had taken care of those flocks and herds for Pharaoh. So that indicates to us that Pharaoh is not an Egyptian. He is someone else. He's probably part of the Hyksos people that came in. And we'll talk more about that people when we get over into Exodus, but it's important for us to recognize that right now, that this Pharaoh that loved Joseph was not an Egyptian. Okay. So we'll talk about more of that later on. And so then Pharaoh would allow them to stay in Goshen away from the Egyptians where there wouldn't be any strife or issues of that nature. Any comments or questions before we conclude this morning?
Jeremy, do you think that Jacob and his children could not recognize Joseph? For one thing, they sold him into slavery. And it had been so long since they had seen him. And he may have changed in looks, age.
That's a possibility. For all intents and purposes, Joseph is an Egyptian now. He dresses like an Egyptian. To coin a phrase, he walks like an Egyptian. I mean, everything he does is like an Egyptian. He speaks like an Egyptian. But, we studied last Sunday morning that when his brothers came, he felt the need to somewhat disguise himself. And so he had hidden his identity from them, too. Okay, good questions, good comments. Thank you so much for your time.